Chapter 19. Do you whiz so hot can be? That was the guide. That was what the guide asked when we were looking up at the bronze horses on the Arch of Peace. It meant, do you wish to go up there? I give it as a specimen of guide English. These are the people that make life a burthen to the tourist. Their tongues are never still. They talk forever and ever. And that is the kind of billingsgate they use. Inspiration itself could hardly comprehend them. If they would only show you a masterpiece of art, or a venerable tomb, or a prison house, or a battlefield hallowed by touching memories, or historical reminiscences, or grand traditions, and then step aside and hold still for 10 minutes and let you think, it would not be so bad. But they interrupt every dream, every pleasant train of thought, with their tiresome cackling. Sometimes, when I have been standing before some cherished old idol of mine that I remembered years and years ago in pictures in the geography at school, I have thought I would give a whole world if the human parrot at my side would suddenly perish where he stood and leave me to gaze and ponder and worship. Now, we did not viz so hot can be. We wished to go to La Scala, the largest theater in the world, I think they call it. We did so. It was a large place. 7 separate and distinct masses of humanity, 6 great circles, and a monster parquet. We wished to go to the Ambrosian Library, and we did that also. We saw a manuscript of Virgil with annotations in the handwriting of Petrarch, the gentleman who loved another man's Laura and lavished upon her all through life a love which was a clear waste of the raw material. It was sound sentiment, but bad judgment. It bought both parties fame and created a fountain of commiseration for them in sentimental breasts that is running yet. But who says a word in behalf of poor Mr. Laura? I do not know his other name. Who glorifies him? Who bedews him with tears? Who writes poetry about him? Nobody. How do you suppose he liked the state of things that has given the world so much pleasure? How did he enjoy having another man following his wife everywhere and making her name a familiar word in every garlic exterminating mouth in Italy with his sonnets to her preempted eyebrows? They got fame and sympathy. He got neither. This is a peculiarly felicitous instance of what is called poetical justice. It is all very fine, but it does not chime with my notions of right. It is too one-sided, too ungenerous. Let the world go on fretting about Laura and Petrarch if it will, but as for me, my tears and my lamentations shall be lavished upon the unsung defendant. We saw also an autograph letter of Lucretia Borgia, a lady for whom I have always entertained the highest respect on account of her rare histrionic capabilities, her opulence in solid gold goblets made of gilded wood, her high distinction as an operatic screamer, and the facility with which she could order a sextuple funeral and get the corpses ready for it. We saw one single coarse yellow hair from Lucretia's head, likewise. It awoke emotions, but we still live. In this same library we saw some drawings by Michelangelo. These Italians call him Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. They spell it Vinci and pronounce it Vinci. Foreigners always spell better than they pronounce. We reserved our opinion of these sketches. In another building, they showed us a fresco representing some lions and other beasts drawing chariots, and they seemed to project so far from the wall that we took them to be sculptures. The artist had shrewdly highlighted the delusion by painting dust on the creatures' backs, as if it had fallen there naturally and properly. Smart fellow, if it be smart to deceive strangers. Elsewhere we saw a huge Roman amphitheater with its stone seats still in good preservation. Modernized, it is now the scene of more peaceful recreations than the exhibition of a party of wild beasts with Christians for dinner. Part of the time, the Milanese use it for a racetrack, and at other seasons they flood it with water and have spirited yachting regattas there. The guide told us these things, and he would hardly try so hazardous an experiment as the telling of a falsehood, when it is all he can do to speak the truth in English without getting the lockjaw. In another place we were shown a sort of summer arbor with a fence before it. We said that was nothing. We looked again and saw through the arbor an endless stretch of garden and shrubbery and grassy lawn. We were perfectly willing to go in there and rest, but it could not be done. It was only another delusion, a painting by some ingenious artist with little charity in his heart for tired folks. The deception was perfect. No one could have imagined the park was not real. We even thought we smelled the flowers at first. We got a carriage at twilight and drove in the shaded avenues with the other nobility, and after dinner we took wine and ices in a fine garden with the great public. The music was excellent. The flowers and shrubbery were pleasant to the eye. The scene was vivacious. Everybody was genteel and well behaved, and the ladies were slightly mustached and handsomely dressed, but very homely. We adjourned to a cafe and played billiards an hour, and I made 6 or 7 points by the doctor picking and pocketing his ball, and he made as many by pocketing my ball. We came near making a carom sometimes, but not the one we were trying to make. The table was of the usual European style. Cushions dead and twice as high as the balls, the cues in bad repair. The natives play only a sort of pool on them. We have never seen anybody playing the French 3-ball game yet, and I doubt if there is any such game known in France, or that there lives any man mad enough to try to play it on one of these European tables. We had to stop playing finally because Dan got to sleeping 15 minutes between the counts and paying no attention to his marking. After we walked up and down one of the most populous streets for some time, enjoying other people's comfort and wishing we could export some of it to our restless, driving vitality-consuming marts and at home, just in this one matter lies the main charm of life in Europe. Comfort. In America, we hurry, which is well, but when the day's work is done, we go on thinking of losses and gains. We plan for the morrow. We even carry our business cares to bed with us and toss and worry over them when we ought to be restoring our racked bodies and brains with sleep. We burn up our energies with these excitements and either die early or drop into a lean and mean old age at a time of life which they call a man's prime in Europe. When an acre of ground has produced long and well, we let it lie fallow and rest for a season. We take no man clear across the continent in the same coach he started in. The coach is stabled somewhere on the plains, and its heated machinery allowed to cool for a few days. When a razor has seen long service and refuses to hold an edge, the barber lays it away for a few weeks, and the edge comes back of its own accord. We bestow thoughtful care upon inanimate objects, but none upon ourselves. What a robust people, what a nation of thinkers we might be if we would only lay ourselves on the shelf occasionally and renew our edges. I do envy these Europeans the comfort they take. When the work of the day is done, they forget it. Some of them go with wife and children to a beer hall and sit quietly and genteelly drinking a mug or two of ale and listening to music. Others walk the streets. Others drive in avenues. Others assemble in the great ornamental squares in the early evening to enjoy the sight and the fragrance of flowers and to hear the military bands play. No European city being without its fine military music at eventide. And yet others of the populace sit in the open air in front of the refreshment houses and eat ices and drink mild beverages that could not harm a child. They go to bed moderately early and sleep well. They are always quiet, always orderly, always cheerful, comfortable, and appreciative of life and its manifold blessings. One never sees a drunk man among them. The change that has come over our little party is surprising. Day by day we lose some of our restlessness and absorb some of the spirit of quietude and ease that is in the tranquil atmosphere about us and the demeanor of the people. We grow wise apace. We begin to comprehend what life is for. We have had a bath in Milan in a public bathhouse. They were going to put all three of us in one bathtub, but we objected. Each of us had an Italian farm on his back. We could have felt affluent if we had been officially surveyed and fenced in. We chose to have 3 bathtubs, and large ones, tubs suited to the dignity of aristocrats who had real estate, and brought it with them. After we were stripped and had taken the first chilly dash, we discovered that haunted atrocity that has embittered our lives in so many cities and villages of Italy and France. There was no soap. I called. A woman answered, and I barely had time to throw myself against the door. She would have been in another second. I said, "Beware, woman. Go away from here. Go away now, or it will be the worse for you. I am an unprotected male, but I will preserve my honor at the peril of my life." These words must have frightened her, for she scurried away very fast. Dan's voice rose on the air.
"Oh, bring some soap, why don't you?"
The reply was Italian. Dan resumed.
"Soap, you know, soap. That is what I want. Soap. S-O-A-P. Soap. 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 Soup. Soap. Hurry up. I don't know how you Irish spell it, but I want it. Spell it to suit yourself, but fetch it. I'm freezing."
I heard the doctor say impressively, "Dan, how often have we told you that these foreigners cannot understand English? Why will you not depend upon us? Why will you not tell us what you want and let us ask for it in the language of the country? It would save us a great deal of the humiliation of your reprehensible ignorance causes us. I will address this person in his mother tongue. Here, Cospito, Corpo di Bacco, Sacramento, Solferino, soap, you son of a gun. Dan, if you would let us talk for you, you would never expose your ignorant vulgarity." Even this fluent discharge of Italian did not bring the soap at once, but there was a good reason for it. There was not such an article about the establishment. It is my belief that there never had been. They had to send far uptown and to several different places before they finally got it, so they said. We had to wait 20 or 30 minutes. The same thing had occurred the evening before at the hotel. I think I have divined the reason for this state of things at last. The English know how to travel comfortably, and they carry soap with them. Other foreigners do not use the article. At every hotel we stop at, we always have to send out for soap at the last moment, when we are grooming ourselves for dinner, and they put it in the bill along with the candles and other nonsense. In Marseille, they make half the fancy toilet soap we consume in America, but the Marseillese only have a vague theoretical idea of its use, which they have obtained from books of travel, just as they have acquired an uncertain notion of clean shirts and the peculiarities of the gorilla and other curious matters. This reminds me of poor Blucher's note to the landlord in Paris. Paris, les 7 Juliet, Monsieur the landlord. Sir, pourquoi don't you mettez some savon in your bedchambers? Est-ce vous pensez I will steal it? La nuit passée you charged me for deux chandelles when I only had one. Et vous avez charged me avec glace when I had none at all. Tous les jours you are coming for some fresh game or other on me, mais vous ne pouvez pas play this savon d'argent me twice. Savon is a necessary de la vie to anybody but a Frenchman. Let les honors de ce hotel make trouble, you hear me? Allons, Blucher. I remonstrated against the sending of this note, because it was so mixed up that the landlord would never be able to make head or tail of it. But Blucher said he guessed the old man could read the French of it and average the rest. Blucher's French is bad enough, but it is not much worse than the English one finds in the advertisements all over Italy every day. For instance, observe the printed card of the hotel we shall probably stop at on the shores of Lake Como. Notice, this hotel, which is the best it is in Italy and most superb, is handsome located on the best situation of the lake, with the most splendid view near the Valley Melzi to the King of Belgium and Cerbelloni. This hotel have recently enlarged, do offer all commodities on moderate price, at the strangers gentlemen who wish spend the season on the lake come. How is that for a specimen? In the hotel is a handsome little chapel where an English clergyman is employed to preach to such of the guests of the house as hail from England and America. And this fact is also set forth in barbarous English in the same advertisement. Wouldn't you have supposed that the adventurous linguist who framed the card would have known enough to submit it to that clergyman before he sent it to the printer? Here in Milan, in an ancient tumble-down ruin of a church, is the mournful wreck of the most celebrated painting in the world, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. We are not infallible judges of pictures, but of course we went there to see this wonderful painting, once so beautiful, always so worshipped by masses in the art, and forever to be famous in song and story. And the first thing that occurred was the infliction on us of a placard, fairly reeking with wretched English. Take a morsel of it. Bartholomew, that is the first figure on the left-hand side at the spectator, uncertain and doubtful about what he thinks to have heard, and upon which he wants to be assured by himself at Christ and by no others. Good, isn't it? And then Peter is described as argumenting in a threatening and angrily condition at Judas Iscariot. This paragraph recalls the picture The Last Supper is painted on the dilapidated wall of what was a little chapel attached to the main church in ancient times, I suppose. It is battered and scarred in every direction, and stained and discolored by time, and Napoleon's horses kicked the legs off most of the disciples when the horses, not the disciples, were stabled there more than half a century ago. I recognized the old picture in a moment. The Savior with bowed head, seated at the center of a long, rough table with scattering fruits and dishes upon it, and 6 disciples on either side in their long robes, talking to each other, the picture from which all engravings and all copies have been made for 3 centuries. Perhaps no living man has ever known an attempt to paint the Lord's Supper differently. The world seems to have become settled in the belief, long ago that it is not possible for human genius to outdo this creation of Da Vinci's. I suppose painters will go on copying it as long as any of the original is left visible to the eye. There were a dozen easels in the room, and as many artists transferring the great picture to their canvases. 50 proofs of steel engravings and lithographs were scattered around, too, and as usual I could not help noticing how superior the copies were to the original, that is, to my inexperienced eye. Wherever you find a Raphael, a Rubens, a Michelangelo, a Carisi, or a Da Vinci, and we see them every day, you find artists copying them, and the copies are always the handsomest. Maybe the originals were handsome when they were new, but they are not now. The colors are dimmed with age, the countenances are scaled and marred, and nearly all expression is gone from them. The hair is a dead blur upon the wall, and there is no life in the eyes. Only the attitudes are certain. People come here from all parts of the world and glorify this masterpiece. They stand entranced before it with bated breath and parted lips, and when they speak, it is only in the catchy ejaculations of rapture.
Oh, wonderful! Such expressions! Such grace of attitude! Such dignity! Such faultless drawing! Such matchless coloring! Such feeling! What a delicacy of touch! What a sublimity of conception! A vision! A vision!
I only envy these people. I envy them their honest admiration, if it be honest, their delight, if they feel delight. I harbor no animosity toward any of them. But at the same time, the thought will intrude itself upon me. How can they see what is not visible? What would you think of a man who looked at some decayed, blind, toothless, pockmarked Cleopatra and said, "What matchless beauty! What soul! What expression!" What would you think of a man who gazed upon a dingy, foggy sunset and said, "What sublimity! What feeling! What richness of coloring!" What would you think of a man who stared in ecstasy upon a desert of stumps and said, "Oh, my soul, my beating heart, what a noble forest is here"? Would you think that those men had an astonishing talent for seeing things that are already passed away? It was what I thought when I stood before the Last Supper and heard men apostrophizing wonders and beauties and perfections which had faded out of the picture and gone 100 years before they were born. We can imagine that beauty that was once in an aged face. We can imagine the forest if we see the stumps, but we cannot absolutely see these things when they are not there. I am willing to believe that the eye of the practiced artist can rest upon the Last Supper and renew a luster where only a hint of it is left, supply a tint that has faded away, restore an expression which is gone, patch and color, and add to the dull canvas until at last its figures shall stand before him aglow with the life, the feeling, the freshness, yea, with all the noble beauty that was theirs when they first came from the hand of the Master. But I cannot work this miracle. Can those other uninspired visitors do it, or do they only happily imagine that they do? After reading so much about it, I am satisfied that the Last Supper was a very miracle of art once, but it was 300 years ago. It vexes me to hear people talk so glibly of feeling, expression, tone, and those other easily acquired and inexpensive technicalities of art that make such a fine show in conversations concerning pictures. There is not one man in 7,500 that can tell what a pictured face is intended to express. There is not one man in 500 that can go into a courtroom and be sure that he will not mistake some harmless innocent for a juryman for the black-hearted assassin on trial. Yet such people talk of character and presume to interpret expression in pictures. There is an old story that Matthews, the actor, was once lauding the ability of the human face to express the passions and emotions hidden in the breast. He said the countenance could disclose what was passing in the heart plainer than the tongue could.
Now,
He said,
observe my face. What does it express?
"Despair!" "Bah, it expresses peaceful resignation." "What does this express?" "Rage." "Stuff, it means terror." "This." "Imbecility." "Fool, it is smothered ferocity." "Now this." "Joy." "Oh, perdition. Any ass can see it means insanity." Expression. People coolly pretend to read it who would think themselves presumptuous if they pretended to interpret the hieroglyphics on the obelisks of Luxor, yet they are fully as competent to do the one thing as the other. I have heard two very intelligent critics speak of Murillo's Immaculate Conception, now in the museum at Seville, within the past few days. One said, "Oh, the Virgin's face is full of the ecstasy of a joy that is complete, that leaves nothing more to be desired on earth." The other said,
Ah, that wonderful face is so humble, so pleading. It says as plainly as words could say it, I fear, I tremble, I am unworthy. But thy will be done. Sustain thou thy servant.
The reader can see the picture in any drawing room. It can be easily recognized. The Virgin, the only young and really beautiful Virgin that was ever painted by one of the old masters, some of us think, stands in the crescent of the new moon, with a multitude of cherubs hovering about her, and more coming. Her hands are crossed upon her breast, and upon her uplifted countenance falls a glory out of the heavens. The reader may amuse himself, if he chooses, in trying to determine which of these gentlemen read the Virgin's expression aright, or if either of them did it. Anyone who is acquainted with the old masters will comprehend how much the Last Supper is damaged when I say that the spectator cannot really tell now whether the disciples are Hebrews or Italians. These ancient painters never succeeded in denationalizing themselves. The Italian artists painted Italian virgins. The Dutch painted Dutch virgins. The virgins of the French painters were Frenchwomen. None of them ever put into the face of the Madonna that indescribable something which proclaims the Jewess, whether you find her in New York, in Constantinople, in Paris, Jerusalem, or in the Empire of Morocco. I saw in the Sandwich Islands once a picture copied by a talented German artist from an engraving in one of the American illustrated papers. It was an allegory representing Mr. Davis in the act of signing a secession act or some such document. Over him hovered a ghost of Washington in warning attitude, and in the background a troop of shadowy soldiers in continental uniform were limping with shoeless, bandaged feet through a driving snowstorm. Valley Forge was suggested, of course. The copy seemed accurate, and yet there was a discrepancy somewhere. After a long examination, I discovered what it was. The shadowy soldiers were all Germans. Jeff Davis was a German. Even the hovering ghost was a German ghost. The artist had unconsciously worked his nationality into the picture. To tell the truth, I am getting a little perplexed about John the Baptist and his portraits. In France, I finally grew reconciled to him as a Frenchman. Here he is unquestionably an Italian. What next? Can it be possible that the painters make John the Baptist a Spaniard in Madrid and an Irishman in Dublin? We took an open barouche and drove 2 miles out of Milan to seize the echo, as the guide expressed it. The road was smooth. It was bordered by trees, fields, and grassy meadows, and the soft air was filled with the odor of flowers. Troops of picturesque peasant girls, coming from work, hooted at us, shouted at us, made all manner of game of us, and entirely delighted me. My long-cherished judgment was confirmed. I always did think those frowsy, romantic, unwashed peasant girls I had read so much about in poetry were a glaring fraud. We enjoyed our jaunt. It was an exhilarating relief from tiresome sightseeing. We distressed ourselves very little about the astonishing echo the guide talked so much about. We were growing accustomed to encomiums on wonders that too often proved no wonders at all, and so we were most happily disappointed to find in the sequel that the guide had even failed to rise to the magnitude of his subject. We arrived at a tumble-down old rookery called the Palazzo Simonetti, a massive hewn stone affair occupied by a family of ragged Italians. A good-looking young girl conducted us to a window on the second floor, which looked out on a court walled on three sides by tall buildings. She put her head out the window and shouted. The echo answered more times than we could count. She took a speaking trumpet, and through it she shouted, sharp and quick, a single "Ha!" The echo answered, "Ha, ha, 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 ha," and finally went off into a rollicking convulsion of the jolliest laughter that could be imagined. It was so joyful, so long continued, so perfectly cordial and hearty that everybody was forced to join in. There was no resisting it. Then the girl took a gun and fired it. We stood ready to count the astonishing clatter of reverberations. We could not say 1, 2, 3 fast enough, but we could dot our notebooks with our pencil points almost rapidly enough to take down a sort of shorthand report of the result. My page revealed the following account. I could not keep up, but I did as well as I could. I set down 52 distinct repetitions, and then the echo got the advantage of me. The doctor set down 64, and thenceforth the echo moved too fast for him also. After the separate concussions could no longer be noted, the reverberations dwindled to a wild, long-sustained clatter of sounds, such as a watchman's rattle produces. It is likely that this is the most remarkable echo in the world. The doctor, in jest, offered to kiss the young girl, and was taken a little aback when she said he might for a franc. The commonest gallantry compelled him to stand by his offer, and so he paid the franc and took the kiss. She was a philosopher. She said a franc was a good thing to have, and she did not care anything for one paltry kiss, because she had 1,000,000 left. Then our comrade, always a shrewd businessman, offered to take the whole cargo at 30 days, but that little financial scheme was a failure. Chapter 20. We left Milan by rail. The cathedral, 6 or 7 miles behind us, vast, dreamy, bluish, snow-clad mountains 20 miles in front of us. These were the accented points in the scenery. The more immediate scenery consisted of fields and farmhouses outside the car, and a monster-headed dwarf and a mustached woman inside it. These latter were not show people. Alas, deformity and female beards are too common in Italy to attract attention. We passed through a range of wild, picturesque hills, steep-wooded, cone-shaped, with rugged crags projecting here and there, and with dwellings and ruinous castles perched away up toward the drifting clouds. We lunched at the curious old town of Como, at the foot of the lake, and then took the small steamer and had an afternoon's pleasure excursion to this place, Bellagio. When we walked ashore, a party of policemen, people whose cocked hats and showy uniforms would shame the finest uniform in the military service of the United States, put us into a little stone cell and locked us in. We had the whole passenger list for company, but their room would have been preferable. For there was no light, there were no windows, no ventilation. It was close and hot. We were much crowded. It was the Black Hole of Calcutta on a small scale. Presently a smoke rose about our feet, a smoke that smelled of all the dead things of earth, of all the putrefaction and corruption imaginable. We were there 5 minutes, and when we got out it was hard to tell which of us carried the vilest fragrance. These miserable outcasts called that fumigating us, and the term was a tame one indeed. They fumigated us to guard themselves against the cholera, though we hailed from no infected port. We had left the cholera far behind us all the time. However, they must keep epidemics away somehow or other, and fumigation is cheaper than soap. They must either wash themselves or fumigate other people. Some of the lower classes had rather die than wash, but the fumigation of strangers causes them no pangs. They need no fumigation themselves. Their habits make it unnecessary. They carry their preventative with them. They sweat and fumigate all the day long. I trust I am a humble and a consistent Christian. I try to do what is right. I know it is my duty to pray for them that despitefully use me, and therefore, hard as it is, I shall still try to pray for these fumigating, macaroni-stuffing organ grinders. Our hotel sits at the water's edge. At least its frozen garden does. And we walk among the shrubbery and smoke at twilight. We look afar off at Switzerland and the Alps, and feel an indolent willingness to look no closer. We go down the steps and swim in the lake. We take a shapely little boat and sail abroad among the reflections of the stars, lie on the thwarts and listen to the distant laughter, the singing, the soft melody of flutes and guitars that comes floating across the water from pleasuring gondolas. We close the evening with exasperating billiards on one of those same old execrable tables. A midnight luncheon in our ample bedchamber, a final smoke in its contracted veranda facing the water, the gardens and the mountains, a summing up of the day's events. Then to bed, with drowsy brains harassed with a mad panorama that mixes up pictures of France, of Italy, of the ship, of the ocean, of home, in grotesque and bewildering disorder. Then a melting away of familiar faces, of cities, and of tossing waves into a great calm of forgetfulness and peace. After which, the nightmare. Breakfast in the morning, and then the lake. I did not like it yesterday. I thought Lake Tahoe was much finer. I have to confess now, however, that my judgment erred somewhat, though not extravagantly. I always had an idea that Como was a vast basin of water, like Tahoe, shut in by great mountains. Well, the border of huge mountains is here, but the lake itself is not a basin. It is as crooked as any brook, and only from 1/4 to 2/3 as wide as the Mississippi. There is not a yard of low ground on either side of it, nothing but endless chains of mountains that spring abruptly from the water's edge and tower to altitudes varying from 1,000 to 2,000 feet. Their craggy sides are clothed with vegetation, and white specks of houses peep out from the luxuriant foliage everywhere. They are even perched upon jutting and picturesque pinnacles 1,000 feet above your head. Again, for miles along the shores, handsome country seats, surrounded by gardens and groves, sit fairly in the water, sometimes in nooks carved by nature out of the vine-hung precipices, and with no ingress or egress save by boats. Some have great broad stone staircases leading down to the water, with heavy stone balustrades ornamented with statuary and fancifully adorned with creeping vines and bright-colored flowers. For all the world like a drop curtain in a theater, and lacking nothing but long-waisted, high-heeled women and plumed gallants in silken tights coming down to go serenading in the splendid gondola in waiting. A great feature of Como's attractiveness is the multitude of pretty houses and gardens that cluster upon its shores and on its mountainsides. They look so snug and so homelike, and at eventide, when everything seems to slumber, and the music of the vesper bells comes stealing over the water, one almost believes that nowhere else on the lake of Como can there be found such a paradise of tranquil repose. From my window here in Bellagio, I have a view of the other side of the lake now, which is as beautiful as a picture. A scarred and wrinkled precipice rises to a height of 1,800 feet. On a tiny bench halfway up its vast wall sits a little snowflake of a church, no bigger than a martin box apparently. Skirting the base of the cliff there are 100 orange groves and gardens, flecked with glimpses of the white dwellings that are buried in them. In front, 3 or 4 gondolas lie idle upon the water, and in the burnished mirror of the lake, mountain, chapel, houses, groves, and boats are counterfeited so brightly and so clearly that one scarce knows where the reality leaves off and the reflection begins. The surroundings of this picture are fine. A mile away, a grove-plumed promontory juts far into the lake and glasses its palace in the blue depths. In midstream, a boat is cutting the shining surface and leaving a long track behind, like a ray of light. The mountains beyond are veiled in a dreamy purple haze. Far in the opposite direction, a tumbled mass of domes and verdant slopes and valleys bars the lake. And here indeed does distance lend enchantment to the view, for on this broad canvas sun and clouds and the richest of atmospheres have blended 1,000 tints together, and over its surface the filmy lights and shadows drift, hour after hour, and glorify it with a beauty that seems reflected out of heaven itself. Beyond all question, this is the most voluptuous scene we have yet looked upon. Last night the scenery was striking and picturesque. On the other side, crags and trees and snowy houses were reflected in the lake with a wonderful distinctness, and streams of light from many a distant window shot far abroad over the still waters. On this side, near at hand, great mansions, white with moonlight, glared out from the midst of masses of foliage that lay black and shapeless in the shadows that fell from the cliff above. And down in the margin of the lake, every feature of the weird vision was faithfully repeated. Today we have idled through a wonder of a garden attached to a ducal estate, but enough of description is enough, I judge. I suspect that this was the same place the gardener's son deceived the Lady of Lyons with, but I do not know. You may have heard of the passage somewhere. A deep vale, shut out by alpine hills from the rude world, near a clear lake, margined by fruits of gold and whispering myrtles, glassing softest skies, cloudless, save with rare and roseate shadows, a palace lifting to eternal heaven its marbled walls, from out a glossy bower of coolest foliage musical with birds. That is all very well, except the clear part of the lake. It certainly is clearer than a great many lakes, but how dull its waters are compared with the wonderful transparence of Lake Tahoe. I speak of the north shore of Tahoe, where one can count the scales on a trout at a depth of 180 feet. I have tried to get this statement off at par here, but with no success, so I have been obliged to negotiate it at 50%. At this rate I find some takers. Perhaps the reader will receive it on the same terms, 90 feet instead of 180, but let it be remembered that those are forced terms, sheriff's sale prices. As far as I am privately concerned, I abate not a jot of the original assertion that in those strangely magnifying waters one may count the scales on a trout of the large kind, at a depth of 180 feet, may see every pebble of the bottom, might even count a paper of drapings. People talk of the transparent waters of the Mexican Bay of Acapulco, but in my own experience, I know they cannot compare with those I am speaking of. I have fished for trout in Tahoe, and at a measured depth of 84 feet I have seen them put their noses to the bait, and I could see their gills open and shut. I could hardly have seen the trout themselves at that distance in the open air. As I go back in spirit and recall that noble sea, reposing among the snow-peaked 6,000 feet above the ocean, the conviction comes strong upon me again that Como would only seem a bedizened little courtier in that august presence. Sorrow and misfortunes overtake the legislature that still from year to year permits Tahoe to retain its unmusical cognomen, Tahoe. It suggests no crystal waters, no picturesque shores, no sublimity. Tahoe for a sea in the clouds, a sea that has character and asserts it in solemn calms at times in savage storms, a sea whose royal seclusions is guarded by a cordon of sentinel peaks that lift their frosty fronts 9,000 feet above the level world, a sea whose every aspect is impressive, whose belongings are all beautiful, whose lonely majesty types the deity. Tahoe means grasshoppers. It means grasshopper soup. It is Indian and suggestive of Indians. They say it is Paiute. Possibly it is Digger. I am satisfied it was named by the Diggers, those degraded savages who roast their dead relatives, that mix the human grease and ashes of bones with tar, and guam it thick all over their heads and foreheads and ears, and go caterwauling about the hills and call it morning. These are the gentry that named the lake. People say that Tahoe means silver lake, limpid water, fallen leaf. Bosh! It means grasshopper soup, the favorite dish of the Digger tribe, and of the Paiutes as well. It isn't worthwhile, in these practical times, for people to talk about Indian poetry. There never was any in them, except in the Fenimore Cooper Indians, but they are an extinct tribe that never existed. I know the noble red man. I have camped with the Indians. I have been on the warpath with them, taken part in the chase with them, for grasshoppers, helped them steal cattle. I have roamed with them, scalped them, had them for breakfast. I would gladly eat the whole race if I had a chance. But I am growing unreliable. I will return to my comparison of the lakes. Como is a little deeper than Tahoe, if people here tell the truth. They say it is 1,800 feet deep at this point, but it does not look a dead enough blue for that. Tahoe is 1,525 feet deep in the center, by the state geologist's measurement. They say the great peak opposite this town is 5,000 feet high, but I feel sure that 3,000 feet of that statement is a good, honest lie. The lake is a mile wide here, and maintains about that width from this point to its northern extremity, which is distant 16 miles. From here to its southern extremity, say 15 miles, it is not over half a mile wide in any place, I should think. Its snow-clad mountains one hears so much about are only seen occasionally, and then in the distance, the Alps. Tahoe is from 10 to 18 miles wide, and its mountains shut it in like a wall. Their summits are never free from snow the year round. One thing about it is very strange. It never has even a skim of ice upon its surface, although lakes in the same range of mountains, lying in a lower and warmer temperature, freeze over in winter. It is cheerful to meet a shipmate in these out-of-the-way places and compare notes with him. We have found one of ours here, an old soldier of the war who is seeking bloodless adventures and rest from his campaigns in these sunny lands. Colonel J. Heron Foster, editor of a Pittsburgh journal, and a most estimable gentleman. As these sheets are being prepared for the press, I am pained to learn of his decease shortly after his return home.
Chapter 21.
We voyaged by steamer down the Lago de Lecco, through wild mountain scenery and by hamlets and villas, and disembarked at the town of Lecco. They said it was 2 hours by carriage to the ancient city of Bergamo, and that we would arrive there in good season for the railway train. We got an open barouche and a wild, boisterous driver and set out. It was delightful. We had a fast team and a perfectly smooth road. There were towering cliffs on our left and the pretty Lago de Lecco on our right, and every now and then it rained on us. Just before starting, the driver picked up in the street a stump of a cigar an inch long and put it in his mouth. When he had carried it thus about an hour, I thought it would be only Christian charity to give him a light. I handed him my cigar, which I had just lit, and he put it in his mouth and returned his stump to his pocket. I never saw a more sociable man. At least, I never saw a man who was more sociable on a short acquaintance. We saw interior Italy now. The houses were of solid stone, and not often in good repair. The peasants and their children were idle, as a general thing, and the donkeys and chickens made themselves at home in drawing-room and bedchamber, and were not molested. The drivers of each and every one of the slow-moving market carts we met were stretched in the sun upon their merchandise, sound asleep. Every 300 or 400 yards, it seemed to me, we came upon the shrine of some saint or other, a rude picture of him built into a huge cross or a stone pillar by the roadside. Some of the pictures of the Savior were curiosities in their way. They represented him stretched upon the cross, his countenance distorted with agony from the wounds of the crown of thorns, from the pierced side, from the mutilated hands and feet, from the scourged body, from every handbreadth of his person, streams of blood were flowing. Such a gory, ghastly spectacle would frighten the children out of their senses, I should think. There were some unique auxiliaries to the painting which added to its spirited effect. These were genuine wooden and iron implements, and were prominently disposed round about the figure. A bundle of nails, the hammer to drive them, the sponge, the reed that supported it, the cup of vinegar, the ladder for the ascent of the cross, the spear that pierced the Saviour's side. The crown of thorns was made of real thorns, and was nailed to the sacred head. In some Italian church paintings, even by the old masters, the Savior and the Virgin wear silver or gilded crowns that are fashioned to the pictured head with nails. The effect is as grotesque as it is incongruous. Here and there, on the fronts of roadside inns, we found huge, coarse frescoes of suffering martyrs like those in the shrines. It could not have diminished their sufferings any to be so uncouthly represented. We were in the heart and home of priestcraft, of a happy, cheerful, contented ignorance, superstition, degradation, poverty, indolence, and everlasting, unaspiring worthlessness. And we said frequently, it suits these people precisely. Let them enjoy it, along with the other animals, and heaven forbid that they be molested. We feel no malice toward these fumigators. We passed through the strangest, funniest, undreamt of old towns, wedded to the customs and steeped in the dreams of the elder ages, and perfectly unaware that the world turns round, and perfectly indifferent, too, as to whether it turns around or stands still. They have nothing to do but eat and sleep and eat, and toil a little when they can get a friend to stand by and keep them awake. They are not paid for thinking. They are not paid to fret about the world's concerns. They were not respectable people. They were not worthy people. They were not learned and wise and brilliant people. But in their breasts, all their stupid lives long, resteth a peace that passeth understanding. How can men, calling themselves men, consent to be so degraded and happy? We whisked by many a gray old medieval castle, clad thick with ivy, that swung its green banners down from towers and turrets, where once some old crusader's flag had floated. The driver pointed to one of these ancient fortresses and said, I translate, "Do you see that great iron hook that projects from the wall just under the highest window in the ruined tower?" We said we could not see it at such a distance, but had no doubt it was there. "Well," he said, "there is a legend connected with that iron hook. Nearly 700 years ago, that castle was the property of the noble Count Luigi Gennaro Guido Alfonso de Genova." "What was his other name?" said Dan. "He had no other name. The name I have spoken was all the name he had. He was the son of poor but honest parents. That is all right. Never mind the particulars. Go on with the legend." "Well, then, all the world at that time was in the wild excitement about the Holy Sepulchre. All the great feudal lords in Europe were pledging their lands and pawning their plate to fit out men-at-arms so that they might join the grand armies of Christendom and win renown in the holy wars. The Count Luigi raised money like the rest, and one mild September morning, armed with battle-axe, portcullis, and thundering culverin, he rode through the greaves and bucklers of his dungeon keep with as gallant a troop of Christian bandits as ever stepped in Italy. He had his sword Excalibur with him. His beautiful countess and her young daughter waved him a tearful adieu from the battering rams and buttresses of the fortress, and he galloped away with a happy heart. He made a raid on a neighboring baron, and completed his outfit with the booty secured. He then razed the castle to the ground, massacred the family, and moved on. They were hardy fellows in the grand old days of chivalry. Alas, those days will never come again. Count Luigi grew high in fame in Holy Land. He plunged into the carnage of 100 battles, but his good Excalibur always brought him out alive, albeit often sorely wounded. His face became browned by exposure to the Syrian sun in long marches. He suffered hunger and thirst. He pined in prisons. He languished in loathsome plague hospitals. And many a time he thought of his loved ones at home, and wondered if all was well with them. But his heart said, "Peace is not thy brother, watching over thy household." 42 years waxed and waned. The good fight was won. Godfrey reigned in Jerusalem. The Christian hosts reared the banner of the cross above the Holy Sepulchre. Twilight was approaching. 50 harlequins in flowing robes approached this castle warily, for they were on foot, and the dust upon their garments betokened that they had traveled far. They overtook a peasant and asked him if it were likely they could get food and a hospitable bed there, for love of Christian charity, and if perchance a moral parlor entertainment might meet with generous countenance. "For," said they, "this exhibition hath no feature that could offend the most fastidious taste." "Marry," quoth the peasant, "an it please your worship, ye had better journey many a good road hence with your juggling circus than trust your bones in yonder castle." "How now, sirrah?" exclaimed the chief monk. "Explain thy ribald speech, or by Our Lady it shall go hard with thee." "Peace, good mountebank. I did but utter the truth that was in my heart. San Paolo be my witness that did ye but find the stout Count Leonardo in his cups, sheer from the castle's topmost battlements, would he hurl ye all. Alack-a-day, the good Lord Luigi reigns not here in these sad times." "The good Lord Luigi?" "Aye, none other, please your worship. In this day The poor rejoiced in plenty, and the rich did oppress. Taxes were not known. The fathers of the church waxed fat upon his bounty. Travelers went and came, with none to interfere, and whosoever would might tarry in his halls in cordial welcome, and eat his bread and drink his wine withal. But woe is me, some 42 years agone, the good count rode hence to fight for Holy Cross, and many a year hath flown since word or token have we had of him. Men say his bones lie bleaching in the fields of Palestine. And now, God a mercy, the cruel Leonardo lords it in the castle. He wrings taxes from the poor. He robs all travelers that journey by his gates. He spends his days in feuds and murders, and his nights in revel and debauch. He roasts the fathers of the church upon his kitchen spits, and enjoyeth the same, calling it pastime. These 30 years Luigi's countess hath not been seen by any in all this land, and many whisper that she pines in the dungeons of the castle, for that she will not wed with Leonardo, saying her dear lord still liveth, and that she will die ere she proves false to him. They whisper likewise that her daughter is a prisoner as well. Nay, good jugglers, seek ye refreshment otherwheres. 'Twere better that ye perished in a Christian way than that ye plunged from off yon dizzy tower. Give ye good day. God keep ye, gentle knave. Farewell. But heedless of the peasant's warning, the players moved straight away toward the castle. Word was brought to Count Leonardo that a company of mountebanks besought his hospitality. "'Tis well. Dispose of them in the customary manner. Yet stay, I have need of them. Let them come hither. Later, cast them from the battlements. Or, how many priests have ye on hand?" "The day's results are meagre, my good lord. An abbot and a dozen beggarly friars is all we have." "Hell and furies! Is the estate going to seed? Send hither the mountebanks. Afterward, broil them with the priests." The robed and close-cowled harlequins entered. The grim Leonardo sate in state at the head of his council board. Ranged up and down the hall on either hand stood near 100 men-at-arms. "Ha, villains," quoth the count, "what can ye do to earn the hospitality ye crave? Dread lord and mighty, crowded audiences have greeted our humble efforts with rapturous applause. Among our body count, we, the versatile and talented Ugolino, the justly celebrated Rudolfo, the gifted and accomplished Roderigo, the management, have spared neither pains nor expense. 'Sdeath, what can ye do? Curb thy prating tongue. Good my lord, in acrobatic feats, in practice, with the dumbbells and balancing and ground, and lofty tumble we are versed. And sith your highness asketh me, I venture here to put that in the truly marvelous and entertaining Zampillero station. Gag him! Throttle him, body of Bacchus! Am I a dog that I am to be assailed with polysyllabled blasphemy like this? But hold, Lucretia. Isabel, stand forth. Sirrah, behold this dame, this weeping wench. First I marry her, with the hour. The other shall dry her tears or feed the vultures. Thou and thy vagabonds shall crown the wedding with thy merrymakings. Fetch hither the priest." The dame sprang toward the chief player. "Oh, save me!" she cried. "Save me from a fate far worse than death. Behold these sad eyes, these sunken cheeks, this withered frame. See thou the wreck this fiend hath made, and let thy heart be moved with pity. Look upon this damosel. Note her wasted form, her halting step, her bloomless cheeks where youth should blush and happiness exult in smiles. Hear us and have compassion. This monster was my husband's brother. He who should have been our shield against all harm hath kept us shut within the noisome caverns of his dungeon. Keep for lo these 30 years, and for what crime? None other than that I would not belie my troth, root out my strong love for him who marches with the legions of the cross in Holy Land, for oh, he is not dead, and wed with him. Save us, O thy persecuted suppliants." She flung herself at his feet and collapsed at his knees. Ha ha ha! Shouted the brutal Leonardo. Priest to thy work! And he dragged the weeping dame from her refuge. Say, once for all, will you be mine? For by my halidome, that breath that uttereth thy refusal shall be thy last on earth. Never? Then die! And the sword leapt from its scabbard. Quicker than thought, quicker than the lightning's flash, 50 monkish habits disappeared, and 50 knights in splendid armor stood revealed. 50 falchions gleamed in air above the men-at-arms, and brighter, fearsomer than them all, flamed Excalibur aloft, and cleaving down, struck the brutal Leonardo's weapon from his grasp. A Luigi to the rescue! Whoop! A Leonardo tear an ounce! O God, my husband! O God, my wife! My father, my precious! Count Luigi bound his usurping brother, hand and foot. The practiced knights from Palestine made holy-day sport of carving the awkward men-at-arms into chops and steaks. The victory was complete. Happiness reigned. The knights all married the daughter. Joy, wassail, finis. But what did they do with the wicked brother? Oh, nothing. Only hanged him on that iron hook I was speaking of. By the chin. As how? Passed it up into his through his gills into his mouth. Leave him there. Couple of years. Ah, is he dead? 650 years ago, or some such matter. Splendid legend. Splendid lie. Drive on. We reached the quaint old fortified city of Bergamo, the renowned in history, some 3/4 of an hour before the train was ready to start. The place has 30 or 40,000 inhabitants, and is remarkable for being the birthplace of Harlequin. When we discovered that legend of our driver took itself a new interest in our eyes. Rested and refreshed, we took the rail, happy and contented. I shall not tarry to speak of the handsome Lago de Gardi, its stately castle that holds in its stony bosom the secrets of an age so remote that even tradition goeth not back to it, the imposing mountain scenery that ennobles the landscape thereabouts, nor yet of ancient Padua or haughty Verona, nor of their Montagues and Capulets, their famous balconies and tombs of Juliet and Romeo et al., but hurry straight to the ancient city of the sea, the widowed bride of the Adriatic. It was a long, long ride, but toward evening, as we sat silent and hardly conscious of where we were, subdued into that meditative calm that comes so surely after a conversational storm, someone shouted, "Venice!" And sure enough, afloat on the placid sea, a league away, lay a great city, with its towers and domes and steeples drowsing in a golden mist of sunset. Chapter 22. This Venice, which was a haughty, invincible, magnificent republic for nearly 1400 years, whose armies compelled the world's applause whenever and wherever they battled, whose navies well nigh held dominion of the seas, and whose merchant fleets whitened the remotest oceans with their sails, and loaded these piers with the products of every clime, is fallen a prey to poverty, neglect, and melancholy decay. 600 years ago, Venice was the autocrat of commerce. Her mart was the great commercial center, the distributing house from whence the enormous trade of the Orient was spread around over the Western world. Today, her piers are deserted, her warehouses are empty, her merchant fleets are vanished, her armies and her navies are but memories. Her glory is departed, and with her crumbling grandeur of wharves and palaces about her, she sits among her stagnant lagoons, forlorn and beggared, forgotten of the world. She that in her palmy days commanded the commerce of a hemisphere and made the weal or woe of nations with a beck of her puissant finger, is become the humblest among the peoples of the earth, a peddler of glass beads for women and trifling toys and trinkets for schoolgirls and children. The venerable mother of the republics is scarce a fit subject for flippant speech or the idle gossiping of tourists. It seems a sort of sacrilege to disturb the glamour of old romance that pictures her to us softly from afar off as through a tinted mist, that curtains her ruin and her desolation from our view. One ought indeed to turn away from her rags, her poverty, and her humiliation, and think of her only as she was when she sunk the fleets of Charlemagne, when she humbled Frederick Barbarossa, or waved her victorious banners over the battlements of Constantinople. We reached Venice at 8 in the evening, and entered a hearse belonging to the Grand Hotel de Europe. At any rate, it was more like a hearse than anything else, though to speak by the card it was a gondola, and this was the storied gondola of Venice, the ferry boat in which the princely cavaliers of the olden times were wont to cleave the waters of the moonlit canals and look the eloquence of love into the soft eyes of patrician beauties, while the gay gondolier in silken doublet touched his guitar and sang as only gondoliers can sing. This the famed gondola, and this the gorgeous gondolier, the one an inky, rusty old canoe with a sable hearse body clapped on to the middle of it, and the other a mangy, barefooted gutter-snipe with a portion of his raiment on exhibition which should have been sacred from public scrutiny. Presently, as he turned a corner and shot his hearse into a dismal ditch between two long rows of towering, untenanted buildings, the gay gondolier began to sing, true to the traditions of his race. I stood it a little while. Then I said, "Now here, Rodrigo Gonzalez Michelangelo, I'm a pilgrim and I'm a stranger, but I am not going to have my feelings lacerated by any such caterwauling as that. If that goes on, one of us has got to take to water. It is enough that my cherished dreams of Venice have been blighted forever as to the romantic gondola and the gorgeous gondolier. This system of destruction shall go no further. I will accept the hearse under protest, and you may fly your flag of truce in peace, but here I register a dark and bloody oath that you shan't sing. Another yelp, and overboard you go." I began to feel that the old Venice of song and story had departed forever, but I was too hasty. In a few minutes we swept gracefully out into the Grand Canal, and under the mellow moonlight the Venice of poetry and romance stood revealed. Right from the water's edge rose long lines of stately palaces of marble. Gondolas were gliding swiftly hither and thither, and disappearing suddenly through unexpected gates and alleys. Ponderous stone bridges threw their shadows athwart the glittering waves. There was life and motion everywhere, and yet everywhere there was a hush, a stealthy sort of stillness that was suggestive of secret enterprises of bravos and of lovers, and clad half in moonbeams and half in mysterious shadows, the grim old mansions of the Republic seemed to have an expression about them of having an eye just out for just such enterprises as these at that same moment. Music came floating over the waters. Venice was complete. It was a beautiful picture, very soft and dreamy and beautiful. But what was this Venice to compare with the Venice of midnight? Nothing. There was a fete, a grand fete in honor of some saint who had been instrumental in checking the cholera 300 years ago, and all Venice was abroad on the water. It was no common affair, for the Venetians did not know how soon they might need that saint's services again, now that the cholera was spreading everywhere. So in one vast space, say a third of a mile wide and 2 miles long, were collected 2,000 gondolas, and every one of them had from 2 to 10, 20, and even 30 colored lanterns suspended about it, and from 4 to a dozen occupants. Just as far as the eye could reach, these painted lights were massed together, like a vast garden of many-colored flowers, except that these blossoms were never still. They were ceaselessly gliding in and out and mingling together and seducing you into bewildering attempts to follow their mazy evolutions. Here and there a strong red, green, or blue glare from a rocket that was struggling to get away splendidly illuminated all the boats around it. Every gondola that swam by us, with its crescents and pyramids and circles of colored lamps hung aloft and lighting up the faces of the young and sweet-scented and lovely below, was a picture, and the reflections of those lights, so long, so slender, so numberless, so many-colored, and so distorted and wrinkled by the waves, was a picture likewise, and one that was enchantingly beautiful. Many and many a party of young ladies and gentlemen had their state gondolas handsomely decorated, and ate supper on board, bringing their swallow-tailed, white-cravated varlets up to wait upon them, and having their tables tricked out as if for a bridal supper. They had brought along the costly globe lamps from their drawing rooms, and the lace and silken curtains from the same places, I suppose. And they had also brought pianos and guitars, and they played and sang operas, while the plebeian paper lantern gondolas from the suburbs and the back alleys crowded around to stare and listen. There was music everywhere, choruses, string bands, brass bands, flutes, everything. I was so surrounded, walled in with music, magnificence, and loveliness, that I became inspired with the spirit of the scene, and sang one tune myself. However, when I observed that the other gondolas had sailed away, and my gondolier was preparing to go overboard, I stopped. The feed was magnificent. They kept it up the whole night long, and I never enjoyed myself better than I did while it lasted. What a funny old city this Queen of the Adriatic is. Narrow streets, vast, gloomy marble palaces, black with the corroding damps of centuries, and all partly submerged. No dry land visible anywhere, and no sidewalks worth mentioning. If you want to go to church, to the theater, or to the restaurant, you must call a gondola. It must be a paradise for cripples, for verily a man has no use for legs here. For a day or two the place looked so like an overflowed Arkansas town, because of its currentless waters laving the very doorsteps of all the houses, and the cluster of boats made fast under the windows, or skimming in and out of the alleys and byways, that I could not get rid of the impression that there was nothing the matter here but a spring freshet, and that the river would fall in a few weeks and leave a dirty high water mark on the houses, and the streets full of mud and rubbish. In the glare of day there is little poetry about Venice, but under the charitable moon her stained palaces are white again, their battered sculptures are hidden in shadows, and the old city seems crowned once more with the grandeur that was hers 500 years ago. It is easy, then, in fancy, to people these silent canals with plumed gallants and fair ladies, with shylocks and gabardine and sandals, venturing loans upon the rich argosies of Venetian commerce, with Othellos and Desdemonas, with Iagos and Rodrigos, with noble fleets and victorious legions returning from the wars. In the treacherous sunlight we see Venice decayed, forlorn, poverty-stricken and commerceless, forgotten and utterly insignificant. But in the moonlight, her 14 centuries of greatness fling their glories about her, and once more she is the princeliest among the nations of the earth. There is a glorious city in the sea. The sea is in the broad, the narrow streets, ebbing and flowing, and the salt seaweed clings to the marble of her palaces. No track of men, no footsteps to and fro, lead to her gates. The path lines over to the sea. Invisible, and from the land we went, as to a floating city, steering in and gliding up her streets as in a dream, so smoothly, silently, by many a dome, mosque-like, and many a stately portico. The statues ranged along an azure sky, by many a pile, in more than eastern pride. Of old the residence of merchant kings, the fronts of some, though time had shattered them, still glowing with the richest hues of art, as though the wealth within them had run o'er. What would one naturally wish to see first in Venice? The Bridge of Sighs, of course, and next the church and the great square of St. Mark, the bronze horses and the famous lion of St. Mark. We intended to go to the Bridge of Sighs, but happened into the Ducal Palace first, a building which necessarily figures largely in Venetian poetry and tradition. In the Senate chamber of the ancient republic, we wearied our eyes with staring at acres of historical paintings by Tintoretto and Paul Veronese. But nothing struck us forcibly except the one thing that strikes all strangers forcibly, a black square in the midst of a gallery of portraits. In one long row around the great hall were painted the portraits of the Doges of Venice, venerable fellows with flowing white beards. For of the 300 senators eligible to the office, the oldest was usually chosen Doge, and each had its complimentary inscription attached, till you came to the place that should have had Marino Faliero's picture in it, and that was blank and black, blank except that it bore a terse inscription saying that the conspirator had died for his crime. It seemed cruel to keep that pitiless inscription still staring from the walls after the unhappy wretch had been in his grave 500 years. At the head of the giant's staircase, where Marino Faliero was beheaded and where the Doges were crowned in ancient times, 2 small slits in the stone wall were pointed out, 2 harmless, insignificant orifices that would never attract a stranger's attention, yet these were the terrible lions' mouths. The heads were gone, knocked off by the French during their occupation of Venice. But these were the throats down which went the anonymous accusation, thrust in secretly at dead of night by an enemy that doomed many an innocent man to walk the Bridge of Sighs and descend into the dungeon which none entered and hoped to see the sun again. This was when, in the old days, when the patricians alone governed Venice. The common herd had no vote and no voice. There were 1,500 patricians. From these, 300 senators were chosen. From the senators, a doge and a council of 10 were selected, and by secret ballot the 10 chose from their own number a council of 3. All these were government spies then, and every spy was under surveillance himself. Men spoke in whispers in Venice, and no man trusted his neighbor, not always his own brother. No man knew who the council of 3 were, not even the Senate, not even the Doge. The members of that dread tribunal met at night in a chamber to themselves, masked and robed from head to foot in scarlet cloaks, and did not even know each other unless by voice. It was their duty to judge heinous political crimes, and from their sentence there was no appeal. A nod to the executioner was sufficient. The doomed man was marched down a hall and out a doorway into the covered Bridge of Sighs, through it and into the dungeon and unto his death. At no time in his transit was he visible to any save his conductor. If a man had an enemy in those days, The cleverest thing he could do was to slip a note for the Council of Three into the lion's mouth, saying, "This man is plotting against the government." If the awful three found no proof, 10 to 1 they would drown him anyhow, because he was a deep rascal, since his plots were unsolvable. Masked judges and masked executioners with unlimited power had no appeal from their judgments. In that hard, cruel age, were not likely to be lenient with men they suspected yet could not convict. We walked through the hall of the Council of 10, and presently entered the infernal den of the Council of 3. The table around which they had sat was there still, and likewise the stations where the masked inquisitors and executioners formerly stood, frozen, upright, and silent, till they received a bloody order, and then, without a word, moved off like the inexorable machines they were to carry it out. The frescoes on the walls were startlingly suited to the place. In all the other saloons, the halls, the great state chambers of the palace, the walls and ceilings were bright with gilding, rich with elaborate carving, and resplendent with gallant pictures of Venetian victories in war, and Venetian display in foreign courts, and hallowed with portraits of the Virgin, the Savior of men, and the holy saints that preached the gospel of peace upon earth. But here, in dismal contrast, were none but pictures of death and dreadful suffering. Not a living figure was but writhing in torture, not a dead one but was smeared with blood, gashed with wounds, and distorted with the agonies that had taken away his life. From the palace to the gloomy prison is but a step. One might almost jump across the narrow canal that intervenes. The ponderous stone bridge of size crosses it at the second story, a bridge that is a covered tunnel. You cannot be seen when you walk in it. It is partitioned lengthwise, and through one compartment walked such as bore light sentences in ancient times, and through the other marched sadly the wretches whom the three had doomed to lingering misery and utter oblivion in the dungeons, or to sudden and mysterious death. Down below the level of the water, by the light of the smoking torches, we were shown the damp, thick-walled cells where many a proud patrician's life was eaten away by the long-drawn miseries of solitary imprisonment, without light, air, books, naked, unshaven, uncombed, covered with vermin, his useless tongue forgetting its office, with none to speak to. The days and nights of his life no longer marked, but merged into one eternal, eventless night, far away from all cheerful sounds, buried in the silence of a tomb, forgotten by his helpless friends, and his fate a dark mystery to them forever, losing his own memory at last, and knowing no more who he was or how he came there, devouring the loaf of bread and drinking the water that were thrust into the cell by unseen hands, and troubling his worn spirit no more with hopes and fears and doubts and longings to be free, ceasing to scratch vain prayers and complainings on the walls where none, not even himself, could see them, and resigning himself to hopeless apathy, driveling childishness, lunacy. Many and many a sorrowful story like these stony walls could tell, if they could but speak. In a little narrow corridor nearby, they showed us where many a prisoner, after lying in the dungeons until he was forgotten by all save his persecutors, was brought by masked executioners and garroted or sewed up in a sack, passed through a little window to a boat at dead of night, and taken to some remote spot and drowned. They used to show visitors the implements of torture wherewith the three were wont to worm secrets out of the accused, villainous machines for crushing thumbs, the stocks where a prisoner sat immovable while water fell drop by drop upon his head, till the torture was more than humanity could bear, and a devilish contrivance of steel, which enclosed a prisoner's head like a shell, and crushed it slowly by means of a screw. It bore the stains of blood that had trickled through its joints long ago, and on one side it had a projection whereupon the torturer rested his elbow comfortably and bent down his ear to catch the moanings of the sufferer perishing within. Of course, we went to see the venerable relic of the ancient glory of Venice, with its pavements worn and broken by the passing feet of 1,000 years of plebeians and patricians. The Cathedral of St. Mark. It is built entirely of precious marbles, brought from the Orient. Nothing in its composition is domestic. Its horrid traditions make it an object of absorbent interest to even the most careless stranger, and thus far it has interest for me, but no farther. I could not go into ecstasies over its coarse mosaics, its unlovely Byzantine architecture, or its 500 curious interior columns from as many different quarries. Everything was worn out. Every block of stone was smooth and almost shapeless, with the polishing hands and shoulders of loungers who devoutly idled here in bygone centuries, and have died and gone to the devil. I mean simply died. Under the altar repose the ashes of St. Mark, and Matthew, Luke, and John, too, for all I know. Venice reveres those relics above all things earthly. For 400 years, St. Mark has been her patron saint. Everything about the city seems to be named after him, or so named as to refer to him in some way. So named, or some purchase rigged in some way to scrape a sort of hurrying acquaintance with him. That seems to be the idea. To be on good terms with St. Mark seems to be the very summit of Venetian ambition. They say St. Mark had a tame lion, and used to travel with him, and everywhere that St. Mark went, the lion was sure to go. It was his protector, his friend, his librarian. And so the winged lion of St. Mark, with the open Bible under his paw, is a favorite emblem in the grand old city. It casts its shadow from the most ancient pillar in Venice, in the grand square of St. Mark, upon the throngs of free citizens below, and has so done for many a long century. The winged lion is found everywhere, and doubtless here, where the winged lion is, no harm can come. St. Mark died at Alexandria, in Egypt. He was martyred, I think. However, that has nothing to do with my legend about the founding of the city of Venice. About the founding of the city of Venice, say 450 years after Christ, for Venice is much younger than any other Italian city, a priest dreamed that an angel told him that until the remains of St. Mark were brought to Venice, the city could never rise to high distinction among those nations, that the body must be captured, brought to the city, and a magnificent church built over it, and that if ever the Venetians allowed the saint to be removed from his new resting place, in that day Venice would perish from off the face of the earth. The priest proclaimed his dream, and forthwith Venice set about procuring the corpse of St. Mark. One expedition after another tried and failed, but the project was never abandoned during 400 years. At last it was secured by stratagem in the year 800 and something. The commander of a Venetian expedition disguised himself, stole the bones, separated them, and packed them in vessels filled with lard. The religion of Mohammed causes its devotees to abhor anything that is in the nature of pork, and so when the Christian was stopped by the officers at the gates of the city, they only glanced once into his precious baskets, then turned up their noses at the unholy lard, and let him go. The bones were buried in the vaults of the grand cathedral, which had been waiting long years to receive them, and thus the safety and the greatness of Venice were secured, and to this day There be those in Venice who believe that if those holy ashes were stolen away, the ancient city would vanish like a dream, and its foundations be buried forever in the unremembering sea. Chapter 23. The Venetian gondola is free and graceful in its gliding movement as a serpent. It is 20 or 30 feet long, and is narrow and deep like a canoe. Its sharp bow and stern sweep upward from the water like the horns of a crescent, with the abruptness of the curve slightly modified. The bow is ornamented with a steel comb and a battle-axe attachment which threatens to cut passing boats in two occasionally, but never does. The gondola is painted black because in the zenith of Venetian magnificence, the gondolas became too gorgeous altogether, and the Senate decreed that all such display must cease, and a solemn, unembellished black be substituted. If the truth were known, it would doubtless appear that rich plebeians grew too prominent in their affection of patrician show on the Grand Canal, and required a wholesome snubbing. Reverence for the hallowed past and its traditions keeps the dismal fashion in force now that the compulsion no longer exists. So let it remain. It is the color of mourning. Venice mourns. The stern of the boat is decked over, and the gondolier stands there. He uses a single oar, a long blade, of course, for he stands nearly erect, a wooden peg 1.5 feet high, with two slight crooks or curves in one side of it, and one in the other, projects above the starboard gunwale. Against that peg the gondolier takes a purchase with his oar, changing it at intervals to the other side of the peg, or dropping it into another of the crooks, as the steering of the craft may demand. And how in the world can he back and fill, shoot straight ahead, or flirt suddenly around a corner, and make the oar stay in those insignificant notches, is a problem to me and a never-diminishing matter of interest. I am afraid I study the gondolier's marvelous skill more than I do the sculptured palaces we glide among. He cuts a corner so closely now and then, or misses another gondola by such an imperceptible hairbreadth, that I feel myself scrooching, as the children say, just as one does when a buggy wheel grazes his elbow. But he makes all his calculations with the nicest precision, and goes darting in and out among a Broadway confusion of busy craft with the easy confidence of the educated hackman. He never makes a mistake. Sometimes we go flying down the great canals at such a gait that we can only get the merest glimpse into front doors, and again, in obscure alleys in the suburbs, we put on a solemnity suited to the silence, the mildew, the stagnant waters, the clinging weeds, the deserted houses, and the general lifelessness of the place, and move to the spirit of grave meditation. The gondolier is a picturesque rascal, for all he wears no satin harness, no plumed bonnet, no silken tights. His attitude is stately. He is lithe and supple. All his movements are full of grace. When his long canoe and his fine figure, towering from its high perch on the stern, are cut against the evening sky, they make a picture that is very novel and striking to a foreign eye. We sit in the cushioned carriage body of a cabin with the curtains drawn, and smoke or read, or look out upon the passing boats, the houses, the bridges, the people, and enjoy ourselves much more than we could in a buggy jolting over our cobblestone pavements at home. This is the gentlest, pleasantest locomotion we have ever known. But it seems queer, ever so queer, to see a boat doing duty as a private carriage. We see businessmen come into the front door, step into a gondola instead of a streetcar, and go off downtown to the counting room. We see young ladies stand on the stoop and laugh and kiss goodbye and flirt their fans and say, "Come soon, now do."
You've been just as mean as ever you can be. Mother's dying to see you, and we've moved into the new house. Oh, such a lovable place. So convenient to the post office and the church and the Young Men's Christian Association. And we do have such fishing and such carrying on and such swimming matches in the backyard. Oh, you must come. No distance at all. And if you go down through by St. Mark's and the Bridge of Sighs and cut through the alley and come up by the Church of Santa Maria di Frari and into the Grand Canal, there isn't a bit of current. Now do come, Sally Maria. Bye-bye.
And then the little humbug trips down the steps, jumps into the gondola, and says under her breath, "Disagreeable old thing, I hope she won't," goes skimming away round the corner, and the other girl slams the street door and says,
"Well, that infliction's over anyway. But I suppose I've got to go see her. Tiresome, stuck-up thing."
Human nature appears to be just the same all over the world. We see the diffident young men, mild of mustache, affluent of hair, indigent of brain, elegant of costume, drive up to her father's mansion, tell his hackman to bail out and wait, start fearfully up the steps and meet the old gentleman right on the threshold, hear him ask what street the new British Bank is in, and if that were what he came for, and then bounce into his boat and scurry away with his coward heart in his boots. See him come sneaking around the corner again, directly with a crack of the curtain open toward the old gentleman's disappearing gondola, and out scampers his Susan with a flock of little Italian endearments fluttering from her lips, and goes to drive with him in the watery avenues down toward the Rialto. We see the ladies go out shopping in the most natural way, and flit from street to street and from store to store, just in the good old fashion, except that they leave the gondola instead of a private carriage waiting at the curbstone a couple of hours for them, waiting while they make the nice young clerks pull down tons and tons of silks and velvets and wire antiques and those things. And then they buy a paper of pens and go paddling away to confer the rest of their disastrous patronage on some other firm. And they always have their purchases sent home just in the good old way. Human nature is very much the same all over the world, and it is so like my dear native home to see a Venetian lady go into a store and buy 10 cents worth of blue ribbon and have it sent home in a scow. Ah, it is these little touches of nature that move one to tears in these far-off foreign lands. We see little girls and boys go out in gondolas with their nurses for an errand. We see staid families with prayer book and beads enter the gondola dressed in their Sunday best and float away to church. And at midnight, we see the theater break up and discharge its swarm of hilarious youth and beauty. We hear the cries of the hackman gondoliers, and behold the struggling crowd jump aboard, and the black multitude of boats go skimming down the moonlit avenues. We see them separate here and there, and disappear up divergent streets. We hear the faint sounds of laughter and of shouted farewells floating up out of the distance, and then, the strange pageant being gone, we have lonely stretches of glittering water, of stately buildings, of blotting shadows, of weird stone faces creeping into the moonlight, of deserted bridges, of motionless boats at anchor, and over all broods that mysterious stillness, that stealthy quiet, that befits so well this old dreamin' Venice. We have been pretty much everywhere in our gondola. We have brought beads and photographs in the stores, and wax matches in the great square of St. Mark. The last remark suggests a digression. Everybody goes to this vast square in the evening. The military bands play in the center of it, and countless couples of ladies and gentlemen promenade up and down on either side, and platoons of them are constantly drifting away toward the old cathedral and by the venerable column with the winged lion of St. Mark on its top, and out to where the boats lie moored, and other platoons are as constantly arriving from the gondolas and joining the great throng. Between the promenades and the sidewalks are seated hundreds and hundred people hundreds of people at small tables, smoking and taking granita, a first cousin to ice cream, on the sidewalks, or more employing themselves in the same way. The shops in the first floor of the tall rows of buildings in that wall and the three sides of the square are brilliantly lighted. The air is filled with music and merry voices, and altogether the scene is as bright and spirited and full of cheerfulness as any man could desire. We enjoy it thoroughly. Very many of the young women are exceedingly pretty and dress with rare good taste. We are gradually and laboriously learning the ill manners of staring them unflinchingly in the face, not because such conduct is agreeable to us, but because it is the custom of the country, as they say, and as they say the girls like it. We wish to learn all the curious, outlandish ways of all the different countries so that we can show off and astonish people when we get home. We wish to excite the envy of our untraveled friends with our strange foreign fashions which we can't shake off. All our passengers are paying strict attention to this thing, with the end in view which I have mentioned. The gentle reader will never know what a consummate ass he can become until he goes abroad. I speak now, of course, in the supposition that the gentle reader has not been abroad, and therefore is not already a consummate ass. If the case be otherwise, I beg his pardon, and extend to him the cordial hand of fellowship, and call him brother. I shall always delight to meet an ass after my own heart, when I shall have finished my travels. On this subject, let me remark that there are Americans abroad in Italy who have actually forgotten their mother tongue in 3 months, forgot it in France. They cannot even write their address in English in a hotel register. I append these evidences, which I copied verbatim from the register of a hotel in a certain Italian city. John P. Whitcomb, Etatis Unis. William L. Ainsworth, Travailleur. He meant traveler, I suppose. Estates Unis. George P. Morton, Et Fils d'Amérique. Lloyd P. Williams, Et Trois Amis, Ville de Boston, Amérique. J. Ellsworth Baker, Tout de Suite de France, Place de Naissance, Amérique. Destination, La Grande Bretagne. I love this sort of people. A lady passenger of ours tells a fellow citizen of hers who spent 8 weeks in Paris and then returned home and addressed his dearest old bosom friend as Herbert as Mr. Herbert. He apologized, though, and said, "'Pon my soul, it is aggravating, but I can't help it. I've got so used to speaking nothing but French, my dear Herbert. Dame, there it goes again. Got so used to French pronunciation that I can't get rid of it. It is positively annoying, I assure you." This entertaining idiot, whose name was Gordon, allowed himself to be hailed 3 times in the street before he paid any attention, and then begged 1,000 pardons, as he said he had grown accustomed to hearing himself addressed as Monsieur Gordon, with a roll to the R, and that he had forgotten the legitimate sound of his name. He wore a rose in his buttonhole. He gave the French salutation, 2 flips of the hand in front of the face. He called Paris Paris in ordinary English conversation. He carried envelopes bearing foreign postmarks protruding from his breast pocket. He cultivated a mustache and imperial, and did what else he could to suggest to the beholder his pet fancy that he resembled Louis Napoleon, and in a spirit of thankfulness, which is entirely unaccountable considering the slim foundation there was for it, he praised his Maker that he was as he was, and went on enjoying his little life just the same as if he really had been deliberately designed and erected by the great architect of the universe. We think of our Whitcombs and our Ainsworth and our Williamses writing themselves down in dilapidated French in foreign hotel registers. We laugh at Englishmen when we are at home for sticking so sturdily to their national ways and customs, but we look back upon it from abroad very forgivingly. It is not pleasant to see an American thrusting his nationality forward obtrusively in a foreign land, but oh, it is pitiable to see himself making of himself a thing that is neither male nor female, neither fish, flesh, nor fowl, a poor, miserable, hermaphrodite Frenchman. Among a long list of churches, art galleries, and such things visited by us in Venice, I shall mention only one, the Church of Santa Maria de Frari. It is about 500 years old, I believe, and stands on 1,200,000 piles. In it lie the body of Canova and the heart of Titian, under magnificent monuments. Titian died at the age of almost 100 years. A plague which swept away 50,000 lives was raging at the time, and there is notable evidence of the reverence in which the great painter was held, in the fact that to him alone the state permitted a public funeral in all that season of terror and death. In this church also is a monument to the Doge Foscari, whose name a once resident of Venice, Lord Byron, has made permanently famous. The monument to the Doge Giovanni Pesaro in this church is a curiosity in the way of mortuary adornment. It is 80 feet high and is fronted like some fantastic pagan temple. Against it stand 4 colossal Nubians as black as night, dressed in white marble garments. The black legs are bare, and through rents in sleeves and breeches, the skin of shiny black marble shows. The artist was as ingenious as his funeral designs were absurd. There are 2 bronze skeletons bearing scrolls, and 2 great dragons uphold the sarcophagus. On high, amid all this grotesqueness, sits the departed Doge. In the conventual buildings attached to this church are the state archives of Venice. We did not see them, but they are said to number millions of documents. They are the records of centuries of the most watchful, observant, and suspicious government that ever existed, in which everything was written down and nothing spoken out. They fill nearly 300 rooms. Among them are manuscripts from the archives of nearly 2,000 families, monasteries, and convents. The secret history of Venice for 1,000 years is here. Its plots, its hidden trials, its assassinations, its commissions of hireling spies and masked bravos, food ready to hand, for a world of dark and mysterious romances. Yes, I think we have seen all of Venice. We have seen, in these old churches, a profusion of costly and elaborate sepulchral ornamentation, such as we never dreamt of before. We have stood in the dim religious light of these hoary sanctuaries in the midst of long ranks of dusty monuments and effigies of the great dead of Venice, until we seemed drifting back into the solemn past and looking upon the scenes and mingling with the peoples of a remote antiquity. We have been in a half-wakened sort of dream all the time. I do not know how else to describe the feeling. A part of our being has remained still in the 19th century, while another part of it has seemed in some unaccountable way walking among the phantoms of the 10th. We have seen famous pictures until our eyes are weary with looking at them and refuse to find interest in them any longer. And what wonder when there are 1,200 pictures by Palma the Younger in Venice and 1,500 by Tintoretto, and behold, there are Titians and the works of other artists in proportion. We have seen Titian's celebrated Cain and Abel, his David and Goliath, his Abraham's sacrifice. We have seen Tintoretto's monster picture, which is 74 feet long, and I do not know how many feet high, and thought it a very commodious picture. We have seen pictures of martyrs enough and saints enough to regenerate the world. I ought not to confess it, but still, since one has no opportunity in America to acquire a critical judgment in art, and since I could not hope to become educated in it in Europe in a few short weeks, I may therefore as well acknowledge, with such apologies as may be due, that to me it seemed that when I had seen one of these martyrs, I had seen them all. They all have a marked family resemblance to each other. They dress alike in coarse, monkish robes and sandals. They are all bald-headed. They all stand in about the same attitude, and without exception they are gazing heavenward with countenances which the Ainsworths, the Mortons, and the Williamses, it feels, inform me are full of expression. To me there is nothing tangible about these imaginary portraits, nothing that I can grasp and take a living interest in. If great Titian had only been gifted with prophecy and had skipped a martyr, and gone over to England and painted a portrait of Shakespeare, even as a youth, we could all have confidence in now. The world, down to the latest generation, would have forgiven him the lost martyr and the rescued seer. I think posterity could have spared one more martyr, for the sake of a great historical picture of Titian's time and painted by his brush, such as Columbus returning in chains from the discovery of a world, for instance. The old masters did paint some Venetian historical pictures, and these we did not tire of looking at, notwithstanding representations of the formal introduction of defunct doges to the Virgin Mary in regions beyond the clouds clashed rather harshly with the proprieties, it seemed to us. But humble as we are, and unpretending in the matter of art, our researches among the painted monks and martyrs have not been wholly in vain. We have striven hard to learn. We have had some success. We have mastered some things, possibly of trifling import in the eye of the learned, but to us they give pleasure, and we take as much pride in our little acquirements as do others who have learned far more, and we love to display them full as well. When we see a monk going about with a lion and looking tranquilly up to heaven, we know that that is St. Mark. When we see a monk with a book and a pen looking tranquilly up to heaven, trying to think of a word, we know that that is St. Matthew. When we see a monk sitting on a rock looking tranquilly up to heaven with a human skull beside him and without other baggage, we know that that is St. Jerome, because we know that he always went flying light in the matter of baggage. When we see a party looking tranquilly up to heaven, unconscious that his body is shot through and through with arrows, we know that that is St. Sebastian. When we see other monks looking tranquilly up to heaven but having no trademark, we always ask who those parties are. We do this because we humbly wish to learn. We have seen 13,000 St. Jeromes, and 22,000 St. Marks, and 16,000 St. Matthews, and 60,000 St. Sebastians, and 4 million of assorted monks undesignated, and we feel encouraged to believe that when we have seen some more of these various pictures and had a larger experience, we shall begin to take an absorbent interest in them like our cultivated countrymen from Amérique. Now it does give me real pain to speak in this almost unappreciative way of the old masters and their martyrs, because good friends of mine in the ship, friends who do thoroughly and conscientiously appreciate them, and are in every way competent to discriminate between good pictures and inferior ones, have urged me for my own sake not to make public the fact that I lack this appreciation and this critical discrimination myself. I believe that what I have written, and may still write about pictures, will give them pain, and I am honestly sorry for it. I even promised that I would hide my uncouth sentiments in my own breast. But alas, I never could keep a promise. I do not blame myself for this weakness, because the fault must lie in my physical organization. It is likely that such a very liberal amount of space was given to the organ which enables me to make promises, that the organ which should enable me to keep them was crowded out. But I grieve not. I like no halfway things. I had rather have one faculty nobly developed than two faculties of mere ordinary capacity. I certainly meant to keep that promise, but I find I cannot do it. It is impossible to travel through Italy without speaking of pictures. And can I see them through others' eyes? If I did not so delight in the grand pictures that are spread before me every day of my life by that monarch of all the old masters, Nature, I should come to believe, sometimes, that I had in me no appreciation of the beautiful whatsoever. It seems to me that whenever I glory to think that for once I have discovered an ancient painting that is beautiful and worthy of all praise, the pleasure it gives me is an infallible proof that it is not a beautiful picture, and not in any wise worthy of commendation. This very thing has occurred more times than I can mention in Venice. In every single instance, the guide has crushed out my swelling enthusiasm with the remark, "It is nothing. It is not of the Renaissance." I did not know what in the mischief the Renaissance was, and so I always simply had to say, "Ah, so it is. I had not observed it before." I could not bear to be ignorant before a cultivated Negro, the offspring of a South Carolina slave, but it occurred too often for even my self-complacency did that exasperating, "It is nothing. It is of the Renaissance." I said, at last, "Who is this Renaissance? Where did he come from? Who gave him permission to cram the Republic with this execrable daubs?" We learned then that Renaissance was not a man, that Renaissance was a term used to signify what was at best but an imperfect rejuvenation of art. The guide said that after Titian's time, and the time of the other great names we had grown so familiar with, high art declined, then it partially rose again, and inferior sort of painters sprang up, and these shabby pictures were the work of their hands. Then I said, in my heat, that I wished to goodness high art had declined 500 years sooner. The Renaissance pictures suit me very well, though sooth to say at school were too much given to painting real men, and did not indulge enough in martyrs. The guide I have spoken of is the only one we have had yet who knew anything. He was born in South Carolina, of slave parents. They came to Venice while he was an infant. He has grown up here. He is well educated. He reads, writes, and speaks English, Italian, Spanish, and French with perfect facility, is a worshipper of art and thoroughly conversant with it, knows the history of Venice by heart, and never tires of talking of her illustrious career. He dresses better than any of us, I think, and is daintily polite. Negroes are deemed as good as white people in Venice, and so this man feels no desire to go back to his native land. His judgment is correct. I have had another shave. I was writing in our front room this afternoon, and trying hard to keep my attention on my work, and refrain from looking out upon the canal. I was resisting the soft influences of the climate as well as I could, and endeavoring to overcome the desire to be indolent and happy. The boys sent for a barber. They asked me if I would be shaved. I reminded them of my tortures in Genoa, Milan, Como, of my declaration that I would suffer no more on Italian soil. I said, "Not any for me, if you please." I rode on. The barber began on the doctor. I heard him say, "Dan, this is the easiest shave I have had since we left the ship." He said again, presently, "Why, Dan, a man could go to sleep with this man shaving him." Dan took the chair. Then he said, "Why, this is Titian. This is one of the old masters." I rode on. Directly, Dan said, "Doctor, it is perfect luxury. The ship's barber isn't anything to him." My rough beard was distressing me beyond measure. The barber was rolling up his apparatus. The temptation was too strong. I said, "Hold on, please." shave me also. I sat down in the chair and closed my eyes. The barber soaped my face and then took his razor and gave me a rake that well nigh threw me into convulsions. I jumped out of the chair. Dan and the doctor were both wiping blood off their faces and laughing. I said it was a mean, disgraceful fraud. They said that the misery of their shave had gone so far beyond anything they had experienced before that they could not bear the idea of losing such a chance of hearing a cordial opinion from me on the subject. It was shameful, but there was no help for it. The skinning was begun and had to be finished. The tears flowed with every rake, and so did the fervent execrations. The barber grew confused and brought blood every time. I think the boys enjoyed it better than anything they have seen or heard since they left home. We have seen the Campanile and Byron's house, and Balby's the geographer, and the palaces of all the ancient dukes and doges of Venice. We have seen their effeminate descendants airing their nobility in fashionable French attire in the grand square of St. Mark, and eating ices, and drinking cheap wines instead of wearing gallant coats of mail and destroying fleets and armies as their great ancestors did in the days of Venetian glory. We have seen no bravos with poisoned stilettos, no masks, no wild carnival, but we have seen the ancient pride of Venice, the grim bronze horses that figure in 1,000 legends. Venice may well cherish them, for they are the only horses she ever had. It is said there are hundreds of people in this curious city who have never seen a living horse in their lives. It is entirely true, no doubt. And so, having satisfied ourselves, we depart tomorrow, and leave the venerable Queen of the Republics to summon her vanished ships and marshal her shadowy armies, and know again in dreams the pride of her old renown.